Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me that one of the hallmarks of any suit jacket worth its salt is the unclouded definition of its lines, the crispness of its contours. And one of the most important players in this particular game is, of course, the lapel. Now, after attaching the canvas pieces to the front panels of the jacket in the last episode, you may well be thinking that we've already given the lapel all of the structure that it needs in order to fall over the body correctly, in order to achieve this crispness that I'm talking about. And all we need to do now is lay the facing piece over the lapel, stitch around the edge, turn it inside out, and bish bash bosh, Bob is your uncle. But Bob is not your uncle, my friends. Bob is my uncle. And there is still a great deal more that we can do, both to lend the edge of the lapel that extra degree of crispness and definition, and also to encourage it to fold over correctly and to lie over the body correctly. It's going to involve a reasonable amount of this, and of course, as should go without saying, a rather excessive amount of hand sewing, but we all know how I feel about that. Anyway, come along with me while I show you in more detail what I'm talking about, and by the end of the episode, you will know just how to do it as well. So let's get started. Okay, so we have our front panel here. And so again, after the last step with the canvas, we've just trimmed the canvas to correspond basically to where the stitch line is going to go. And this little black bit here is just the seam allowance. Just a quick note, I actually decided, you may remember I had some inlay around here, so it was more like an inch overall or 2.5 centimetres. Perhaps a bit lazy of me, but I just decided to get rid of it, and it's just going to make it easier to show what it is I'm doing. So what I have here is some bias tape. So it was a 2 centimetre wide piece of bias tape that I snipped down the middle lengthwise to create basically a 1 centimetre wide strip. And what we actually want for this purpose is cotton twill tape. So basically just a band that is made of cotton twill fabric. I couldn't really find anything like that, but I've used bias tape instead in the past, and it's worked just fine, so that's what I'm using again today. Obviously it doesn't matter what colour because it's going to be on the inside of the garment, but you want to make sure that it's not like a super thick chunky tape, whatever tape you use. This is very lightweight, and it's sort of not really in competition with the actual weight of the fabric itself, which, like with interfacings, is very important. Anyway, and what we're going to do with this is we are going to lay it around basically the edges of the lapel, so both along the top, along the front edge, and then also beyond the lapel around the rest of the canvas. So again, what this is going to do is lend extra definition and structure to the edges of the lapel itself, and also on the inside of the roll line, and also beyond there along the front of the jacket front panel itself, all the way to the end here where it's going to join at the back. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is baste the tape to the lapel. So I have my needle with basting thread here, and we're going to start by laying it along the top of the lapel. This is going to extend about 1.5 centimetres past the roll line, so there's the roll line of the lapel, so it's just tucking in a little bit there, and yeah, we are just going to baste that into place. So the tape is just flush with the top edge of the canvas there, so beyond the tape is just the seam allowance basically that we're going to have, and you can see there my marked stitches from earlier. Yeah, so we're going to baste along here. And now once we get to this corner here, where obviously it needs to turn around the edge of the lapel, what we're going to do is just snip diagonally into the tape, just to the end, but not quite. Something like that. And that'll fold around like that to continue along the front of the lapel. And we're just going to also snip away this little bit here, just that excess, so it's not too bulky. What we're going to try. There we go, got there in the end. Yeah, and then we're just going to carry on around that edge as well. So we're just basting through all layers here, so the tape, the canvas, and then the lapel itself, so the front panel. It might be a bit stiff depending on the thickness of your tape. So now we're coming towards the bottom of the lapel, and what we're going to do when we get there is insert just about 0.5 centimetre of ease into the tape. So what I mean by that is basically just going to bunch up the tape a little bit, like so, just at the bottom of the roll line. And what that's going to do is that when the lapel is folding over that way, there's going to be enough slack in this tape to let it do so, because if this were to be like really crisp and tight along here, when the lapel folds, it's going to be pulling along the tape, and it's just going to cause this, well yeah, it's just not going to be conducive to a clean fold. So what I'm going to do here, so I've just got to basically the bottom of the roll line, so I've taken a stitch to get there, and I'm just going to back stitch to kind of secure this in place. I'm going to create this little bubble of ease then that I want, tiny little bump like that. I'm going to go back under again, just going to make sure everything's lined up, and come under
and then out where I want to be, beyond the bottom of the roll line. And then, so you can see you've just got that little lump of ease in there, and I'm just going to backstitch again at this point to secure that in place. Yeah, my needlework is pretty terrible, isn't it? But practice makes perfect. So again, we can see there what we have is just this little bump, and that's just going to help, again, when the lapel turns over, there'd be enough slack in the tape to allow it to do so unobstructed. So now we're just continuing to baste around the front edge as normal. So assuming you have a rounded front on your jacket, you're just going to want to start taking slightly smaller stitches to help encourage this straight tape around that sort of curved edge. There might be a little bit of sort of mild rippling in the tape, but that's not really a problem, don't worry about that. Yep, so we've rounded that corner without incident. So just along the straight bottom of the hemline there, bottom of the canvas, until we get to the side seam where it's going to meet the back panel. So we've finished basting, just going to snip obviously the thread, and then also snip this so it's flush with the cutting edge of the... So that again was the edge of my pattern. This is the inlay. I've just cut it there at the point where the pattern edge meets the inlay. Okay, so that's the first step done. Okay, so next what we're going to do is take a remaining piece of tape and we're going to lay some along here. So from the neck edge down just behind the roll line. So actually along the edge of this flannel piece that's covering the plastron, which should be 1/2 centimetre in from the roll line itself. And that's just going to cover basically up to the bottom of the flannel, or about 2/3 down the lapel. So then, as before, we're just going to baste that in place. So we're going to just baste normally until we're 7.5 centimetres or so, or 3 inches down from the top of the lapel to, yeah, into the middle of the lapel. So let's just see how we're doing. Yeah, so we're about there. And then what we do here is we're also going to do another trick like down at the bottom of the roll line, where we're adding a bit of ease, or rather, in this case, doing the reverse. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to backstitch here, again, just to secure what I've basted so far. And then basically for the next 7.5 centimetres or 3 inches, we're just going to pull lightly on the tape as we continue to baste. It can be a bit fiddly if you're rubbish at hand sewing like me. So the idea here is it's kind of doing the reverse of what we've done here, in that we're kind of making sure that the actual jacket panel has rather a bit of ease, because again, that's just going to help it fold over better. So you don't want to do like a really extreme yank, but you just want to make sure that it's like a little bit, you know, rather than there being just a lot of slackness here, it's just taut. So I'll do one more of those stitches, because we're almost at the end of our 7.5 centimetre stretch, I would say. And again, as before, just backstitch to kind of secure that. So the whole thing, we're only going 2/3 the way down on the lapel. In this case, that roughly corresponds to the edge of the flannel, so I'm just going to do to the end of the flannel. So again, signing off, and snippety snip. And then what we're going to do is take our sort of fabric coloured thread, so the same thread that we would have used to pad stitch the lapels, so in this case it's black silk thread for me, and we're going to catch up with our old friend the cross stitch, and we're going to cross stitch this piece of tape to the panel, and we're going to sew through all layers of fabric. And so as with the pad stitch, we want to make sure that we're taking just small points, small pricks through to the actual outer side of the fabric, so you know that we don't have these big stitches visible on the other side, on the right side of the fabric. Although again, obviously this is going to be under the lapel, so as with the pad stitches themselves, which are technically visible, it's not the end of the world because the lapel itself will actually be covering them. But anyway, so we're going to cross stitch along the very edges of the tape, so that, you know, the tape is like fully attached, and this will properly secure this piece of tape to the jacket itself. So if you're not sure how to do a cross stitch, there was a little demo in part 2, I think it was, so you can check that out, or you can just follow what I'm doing here. So in at the bottom, just taking a point through on the other side of the fabric, coming across in the direction I'm coming from, so scooping to the left, and then crossing over towards the top to create this sort of X-like diagonal line, and doing the same at the top. So taking a right to left stitch, again, just a pinprick on the right side of the fabric, and then just continuing like that. So again, just sticking to the edge of the flannel to the bitter end. Just a little back stitch through the tape to secure that. And there you go. So I'm just going to quickly take that to the ironing board and press it, and we're going to do that. So remember when we were pad stitching the lapels and we laid the jacket down so the lapel was hanging off the table edge, we're just going to do the same, hang the lapel over off the straight edge of the ironing board and just press gently press that tape. Okay, well, just when you thought it was safe to go back to the machine, allow me to tell you, you can forget about it because we have the rest of the tape to hand sew. And this time we're going to be doing a slip stitch, but it's the same principle. We are basically taking a little pinprick through to the actual right side of the fabric, the garment fabric, while taking a more robust stitch through the actual tape and canvas. We'll start on the outer edge of the tape because we need to do both the outer and the inner edge of the tape. So again, just tiny prick through to the right side. Again, we are technically sewing only into the seam allowance, so it's not really the end of the world if the stitches are actually kind of visible on the right side of the garment. But either way, you know, it's good practice. So we've taken our stitch and then we go across and then back up through the tape, going forward along the tape and then out to the side, up through the tape, and so on. And yeah, we are just going to do that all the way along the outside of the tape across the whole jacket. So see you in 2026. No real tension required, indeed tension expressly forbidden. And you just keep on like that for the rest of your natural life until you're done. I probably should have prepared like a little story or something to narrate while doing this. But of course, like all hand sewing, relaxing and therapeutic. Until your thread gets tangled or it flies out of your needle. As happens at least every 10th stitch with me. But I edit those out, obviously. And I think you know what happens next after this, so we are after all only halfway there. It's not the destination, it's the journey. Okay, so we're now going to do the inside of the tape going around the jacket, and the thing to bear in mind here is that obviously we're now not sewing into the seam allowance as we were here, we are sewing into the actual garment fabric, so if we were to stitch through to this side, that is going to show on what is going to be the actual outside of the jacket. So certainly for this little stretch, we really just want to be taking like 1 or 2 fibres, kind of like a blind hem stitch if we've ever done that before. And yeah, and then once we get to the canvas, we can just stitch a bit more heftily and just take the canvas but not the garment fabric underneath it. And then once we're up past into the lapel again, then we can just do as we've done before and just sort of stitch through all layers of the fabric, because again the lapel is going to fold over and that's going to be hidden. So again, we're into the canvas now, so we can take slightly more healthy stitches just through the canvas layer and not through to the garment fabric, because again otherwise it would just show through on the front of the jacket and we don't want that. Or maybe you do, you sick, twisted individual, in which case do like my thread and go for it. Okay, so now we're back in the realm of the lapel itself. We are going all the way through now to the right side of the garment fabric with these stitches. So again, just little tiny pinpricks, much in the vein of the pad stitching that we did. Yeah, incidentally, if you found this interesting so far or useful, please do give the video a like. Always makes me feel good, and that, after all, is what this is all about. And of course, if you generally find this kind of stuff interesting and want to see more of it, there will be more of it. There already is more of it on this channel, so you can also subscribe as well and make sure you stay in the loop. Serves the purpose of giving me a big fat dopamine hit, so please don't leave me hanging. Now we have the heartbreaking situation that my thread that I have left in my needle is a few centimetres too short probably to cover the remaining distance. But you know, these are just the occupational hazards that you accept when you get into amateur tailoring, I guess. That being another one. Yeah, but anyway, we're basically done here. I'll finish the rest off camera and then we'll move on to the facings themselves. Okay, so here I have my facing piece. So it's time now to put these two bad boys together. So I'm laying down the facing piece itself right side up and then laying the front panel on top of it. Now, obviously, depending on your pattern or whatever you're using, you just want to line up the facing and the front panel accordingly to how the pattern pieces have cut, or how the panels, sorry, have been cut. But I'm not gonna lie, with all my inlay adding and whatnot, I kind of confused myself a little bit. So I'm just gonna lay it out as I think is best based on the one that I've already done. But yeah, like I say, just line up your facing piece and your front panel piece according to the size of the pieces, how they've been cut. I assume you will know better than I what that means in your particular case. Okay, so I've got my facing lined up. If I sounded vague, it's because it was vague. Maybe a bit unprofessional from me, but you know what? I'm not professional. That's the whole point. So all it will change maybe is that I just need to double check the lining measurements in the next episode. But that's my problem. You guys obviously are much more conscientious than I am, much more careful, much more talented. You won't be making these sorts of mistakes. Anyway, but what we're going to do is we're just going to baste again through the tape along all the way to the end of the facing around there, and that way we're just going to attach the facing to the front of the panel before we properly sew it. So yeah, starting at the top of the lapel and working along like so. And again, these can just be relatively generous stitches. Doesn't have to be anything too, too fine-grained. It's always a auspicious start when the thread immediately knots up. So again, kind of relatively loose stitches, no tension. You're not trying to pucker anything up. Not yet, at least. Okay, so now we've got to the bottom of the roll line. Kind of as we did with the tape before, we want to put a little bit of ease into, this time, the facing piece, and this will be just below the actual end of the roll line rather than kind of over it. So I've gotten to the bottom of the roll line here, and this is kind of how I do it. I kind of back stitch halfway, so I do as if I were doing a back stitch where I go under and then back up again, but I don't come back up again. So I bring the thread through to the side to basically create that back stitch, and then kind of roll it over, pull it up to create that 0.5 centimeters thing again, push through to the other side. So I'm still tacking to the tape just from the facing side now, and then do again this sort of half back stitch to get back to the tape side. And if you can see, there's that little bubble of ease that's sort of trapped there now, and I need to trap it properly by finishing this back stitch. So I'm going to bring that through again to the other side, so through to the tape side. And yeah, so now there should just be that little pocket of ease in there. And as with the ease in the tape that we added, it's just going to help when we turn everything right way out and stuff, the lapel to fold over in the correct way. And then we just carry on. Okay, so we've gotten towards the sort of curved bit at the bottom of the front of the jacket. And what we want to do here is just, I'm just going to delicately turn this around. Well, yeah, so that it looks like this. And what this is essentially doing is, relatively speaking, kind of slightly shortening the facing piece compared to the actual front panel. And what this means is that bottom of the jacket doesn't sort of almost like pop open a little bit when it's being worn and when it's finished. So yeah, just doing that around any curved edge you might have at the bottom of your jacket front. And yeah, and just continuing like this again towards the point where the facing ends. Great. And now one more thing we want to do is, so you see you've got a little bubble of ease in there, sort of. Again, it only needs to be a little bit, and we just want to do the same sort of thing here along the top of the lapel. Okay, so for the purposes of doing this, best if you, when you're first basting along the top of the lapel, to try and go sort of as far in to the lapel onto the tape as you can, so there's still essentially the full width of the tape that's left unbasted. Because what you're going to do then is kind of use, so there's the basting line there, and you're just going to create that sort of, again, really just like a few millimeters of ease, just like a little bubble. And I'm sort of just pushing that into essentially what is the tape underneath, and I'm using the existing basting stitch as a sort of like barrier to kind of hold it in place and create that bubble. So this is the collar notch here. So the collar will extend out to here, and then here will be that sort of triangular shape that you have. So just from a little bit beyond that point, just going to baste again, trying to stay into the tape underneath. So just sort of feel your way in that regard. And yeah, keep that bubbled up slightly. And what this will do is, as with the other sort of little bubbles of ease we've added, it will just enable in this case, the facing to sort of have just that extra bit of slack when we turn it inside out, that it won't be sort of pulling the corner of the lapel up. That'll do the job. So yeah, you can see there's just a slight bit of excess in there, and you can see it's kind of pulled down there, just to prove the point. Now please do try and contain your disbelief. That is indeed the sewing machine. We're actually going to use it now to officially attach the facing to the front panel. So I'm just starting here, which is where the facing ends on the other side, and I'm using, obviously again, this tape is the guide of where the actual edge of the jacket is going to be, so I'm essentially just stitching just outside of where the tape is. And you're just going to obviously follow the curve round. You can walk it around stitch by stitch like this, just to make sure getting it right. And away we go. Yep, so you know, try and take your time here to get it right. Not like I'm doing. No need to whiz through it. I mean, you've taken long enough doing everything else, so you might as well take a while doing this as well. Yeah, try not to sew into the tape like I've done in a couple of places, because that would be incorrect. And when you get to the corner of the lapel, you really want to kind of walk it around stitch by stitch. You don't want to have like a really sharp angle, because remember, this has to be turned inside out, and if it's too pointy on the inside, it's not going to leave the right room for all these seam allowance, although we are going to trim that for the seam allowance to get tucked away. Walking it like this. So we get a nice curve on this corner as we turn it. Yep, and if you see that chalk line there, again, this is the collar notch. So the collar will come to here, and for now we are only sewing up to that point. So you might be that if you're doing the other panel first, you'll probably start from this point and work that way. And she's done for the day. Okay, so we're now going to snip our basting. So all of those basting stitches that we put into the tape and the facing to attach that together, I'm going to take that out now. That's going to get in the way of turning it inside out. It's always nice when they come out with one yank. Fortunately, it doesn't happen very often. Okay, so we've got all the basting out. And now what we need to do is trim these seam allowances, because obviously they're going to be going on the inside of the facing. We don't want them padding up the place too aggressively. So we want to get it so that the actual jacket front panel seam allowance is about 0.5 centimetre, 0.5 millimetres, and then the facing seam allowance is about 1 centimetre. So this is already 1 centimetre, so I'm just going to trim the facing to match what this is now, and then I'll trim this to be basically half of what remains. I'm already doing this from, again, this collar notch here to, well, yeah, to the end of the facing. So. And let's try and be careful here. I know it's against my nature, but I wouldn't want to chop my lapel in half. Okay, so I've pressed that seam open a little bit now after trimming it. And first I'm just going to snip the corners here a little bit. Not my fingers, obviously. I suspect I might need them. Yeah, you can, if you want, sew this seam allowance into the tape on this side, and that will just help it be a bit more like fixed in its position so that, you know, it doesn't randomly spread itself around on the inside of the face. Yep, so I've just tacked that down a little bit into the tape and pressed it, as you can see there, and we're just going to kind of do the same as well here at the rounded end, the rounded edge, bottom edge of the jacket. So wrap the seam allowance around there and tack it onto the tape. You might need to trim it a bit more if it's larger than the tape itself, so I'll just do that. So again, just being careful to only get through to the tape, because otherwise these stitches would show once you turn the facing out if they get through to the right side of the fabric. You have to kind of go by feel a little bit. Don't choose projects like this because they're easy to be. And again, this is just because, you know, these curved points or these sharp points like the lapel tip are just sort of sensitive areas where, if left unchecked or uncontrolled, the seam allowance might decide for itself in what weird and wonderful ways it wants to spread itself out within the seam. And in order to avoid any sort of visible bunching or whatever, we obviously want to just be the ones to decide where and how the seam allowance is controlled. So again, it doesn't have to be anything too fancy. Again, if you feel like you need to trim anything further, you can do so. Freestyling here a little bit, but there's a lot of freestyling in tailoring, so let's live on the edge, literally and figuratively. Okay, so I've sort of tacked that into the tape there around the bottom corner, and I've pressed it, and I've also pressed the hem up because we're just gonna baste that in a sort of rough diagonal stitch now. Only the bit that covers the canvas for now, we'll do the rest later on. Don't worry, the big reveal is coming, and that right soon. And then I'm also just gonna slip stitch the edge of this into the canvas as well. So again, just only picking up the canvas and then through to the hem of the jacket, so not coming through to the right side of the jacket actually. I won't lie, I've perhaps been a little bit loose with these stitches. You know, they're rather large, but I think this dear old hem can take it. Okay folks, hold on to your hats. So last thing, so here again the collar notch, just snipping right up to the stitch line, but definitely not into the stitch line, please, for the love of goodness. Here we go. Doesn't look like much yet. So obviously there's still a lot of basting to do. And the thing with the facing is that for the lapel, the facing will be showing, but below the lapel, the facing will be turning inwards. And what we need to do is baste it so that this seam connecting the lapel and the facing is sort of hidden regardless of which side is being shown. So first thing we do is baste from the roll line upwards around to the collar notch. And when we do so, we are going to make sure that rather in the manner that it is now, only not quite so dramatically, that this seam is kind of rolled over to the underside, because that means that when the lapel eventually is folded over, the seam itself will be hidden. And then when we get around here, we're going to do the reverse and we're going to roll the seam round to the facing side. So I'll show you what I mean. So if you can see, the seam is sort of on the underside of the lapel side. That's where we want it to stay, but really just like a millimetre or so it's not too dramatic. And yeah, so I'm just going to baste that into that kind of position. As I say, from the bottom of the roll line all the way up to that collar notch where the facing stitch ended or began, depending on, you know, your perspective. This is just a great example of the benefits of hand sewing because it gives you so much control while you're doing this. And eventually this position is going to be fixed properly at the very end of the construction when I'm doing the finishing with a pick or prick stitch along the edge of the lapel. But for now, this spacing is just going to hold it in place, both while we finish the construction of the jacket more generally and until that point specifically. And obviously make sure you've turned out the corner of your lapel as best you can. I'm always a bit lazy with this sort of thing. I just give it a bit of a rummage and hope for the best. So we can see there that the facing side of the lapel is kind of coming over just the tiniest little bit, really just like a millimetre if that, and that just means that that seam is hidden. Okay, so we're now doing the same thing for the rest of the facing, but again, because this time it's going in the opposite direction insofar as the front of the jacket, we want to hide the seam behind it on the inside rather than behind the inside of the facing. We're going to just turn it the other way, but in principle it's the same thing. So starting at the bottom of the facing, as in the point at which the facing extends, sewing along the edge and making sure that the front panel of the jacket is sort of rolled towards the inside and hiding that seam, continuing all the way up until that roll line point. And there we will meet up with the beginning of the previous basting stitch. No need to be especially tight or forceful with these stitches. And yeah, and then when you do get to the bottom of the roll line, where essentially it turns, you'll see this kind of crossover point where the seam that was visible on one side then crosses over to the other side and becomes invisible. All right then. So now just some more general basting to keep the facing in position while we continue with the construction. So making sure that both layers are nice and flat. We're starting an inch in from the tape. So if the tape's 1 centimetre, then you're 3.5 centimetres in, because an inch is 2.5 centimetres. Starting at the bottom of the roll line, or roughly there, to the bottom of the lapel, we're just basting up along, following the shape of the lapel itself. This is really just to keep the facing in position as we go forward. So then a couple more stitches, basting stitches on the lapel. So firstly, just from there to there. So from the roll line out to that sort of corner of the lapel. And then one more stitch, probably the millionth basting stitch along this point, but we're just going to baste along the roll line again. And you can already see how much traffic there is basting wise along the roll line, but can't have too much of a good thing. And you guessed it, this is just going to, repeat after me, help keep the facing in position while we continue with the construction of the jacket. You know, don't feel like you have to be too anal about getting it exactly in the sort of ditch of the roll line. Goodness gracious, look at all this basting. You really need to budget at the end of the construction like 2 hours just to unpick all your basting. Okay, now things are getting a little bit spicy again here, right at the death, because we have to make a little incision. So you can feel along there, well, I can, you will be able to on your own, you can't right now, the top of the tape that's going along the lapel. So again, this is from the facing side. You can see the tape on the front panel canvas underneath there. And I'm just going to draw a line with chalk sort of following that same line to about, what was it, about 1.5 centimetres beyond the roll line. So just there. And then, sorry, ignore that line. So from this point that's 1.5 centimetres in from the roll line, roughly sort of parallel, or perpendicular rather, to the top of the lapel line, draw another line out to the edge of the facing. And what you're then going to do is take your scissors and you are going to snip on the facing only down that line to that point. So you're going to have something that looks like that. And then what that allows you to do is take this part of the facing, tuck that in like so. So the top edge of the lapel part of the facing is then directly on top of the tape underneath. You're then going to baste that in place and you're then going to slip stitch it. Ow. Ow. My pride hurts more than my finger. Yep, so like so. And then using your good, nice thread, the one that you've pad stitched with, the one that you've slip stitched with, i.e. your fabric coloured thread, you're then just going to slip stitch that in place. This is the same slip stitch that we used to attach the tape. But again, this is going to be the visible gorge line. So the collar piece is going to connect here. And again, this will be visible on the outside. So you don't want to have like the thread coming out here and, you know, you really just want to be really slipping it into the very edge of this edge, basically. So just catching the top of it. Again, not too tight. I know it's tempting to think the tighter the better, but ain't necessarily so. Believe me, I know. Again, it's times like this I can't believe I decided to start with a pitch black light-eating fabric. Good thing is we're at the end of the journey. Yeah, if anything about what I've done today is not clear or seems contradictory or incorrect, please do let me know in the comments and I will either enlighten you or allow you to enlighten me. I think the latter is much more likely. We will press the facing gently. You know, you don't want tape shape burned through the fabric. Just gently press it to sort of lock those creases in place, as it were, and, you know, also help these turns where we were basting earlier. Yeah, for now, my extremely questionable work here is done. Yep, so press that now from the facing side, nice and gentle, and yeah. So the lining will be attached here, and, well, I don't want to give away the next episode. You will see. Oh, it's a good feeling. It's a good feeling.
What a thrill. Have you ever seen lapels so crisp and clean? You don't answer that. Anyway, we now all know just how to set up our lapels for success, and if you found this video useful, perhaps even entertaining, perhaps even both, please do give it a like. And if you're in the market for more content of this nature, of course, do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Next week, we will be getting started with the lining, and I really can't wait to introduce you all to the questionable fabric that I rather impulsively bought. I'm still unsure as to whether or not I don't entirely despise it, but, you know, waste not, want not, as ever. I'll let you guys be the judge next week. In the meantime, if you're only just checking in on the sewing my wedding suit journey, you can start from the beginning here. And if you may be feeling like getting going with your own tailoring project, but you're not sure how or where to start, then you can check this out. And in the meantime, we're done. Have a good one.